Hey folks, how's it going? This is Jess here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the level editor to make some basic mazes and walk through a couple examples of some of the objects in here. It'll give you a good roadmap for how to use the other objects, etc., and sort of how to get mazes built. Anyway, let's jump into it so I can keep this fairly short. It's pretty straightforward. Let's go up here and create a new maze. You can obviously, once we get these created, you can save them, reopen them, etc. as files. Rename this as My Maze. You can see has a little A next to its icon up here. It's because down here in the lower right it's of maze type A. There's 4 basic maze types in Major Havoc, and if you're familiar with the game, you realize that there's sort of 4 repeating patterns with modifications each time you come up to them. And so maze A is the shape here. B type mazes are this pattern. C type mazes, this pattern. And the other big one is the D types down there. Let's go back to A though to keep this simple for now. As I mentioned, they're all sort of based on this pattern. Whenever there's modifications, each level basically just overwrite these base wall templates. So if we go up here to walls really quick, and let's say I want to fill in this gap here, I'll drop that there, and now I have a filled wall there. Similarly, I'll do that here. Let's do this here. Let's do this one here. And there's some basic modifications. You get the idea. You drag them out. The interface has your mazes listed on the left here just to overview the working canvas, all your objects up here which contain walls, enemies, and sort of static objects that don't kill you. And then down in the lower right are the properties of the selected object. Right now I have this wall selected. It's maze wall 4. It has all these properties. You can click on this drop down to pick your objects explicitly by the list. Otherwise, you can also just click on them in the GUI. I just dropped a wall there accidentally. Let's get rid of it. Delete key is good for deleting objects. You can select these and drag them around with the mouse. You can also use the cursor to move them around. Sometimes things are funky with the mouse, so if you get into trouble, use the cursor or the arrow buttons to move it around. Let's talk about the properties really quick. As you can see, I have a wall selected. All the properties are different depending on the object. We'll go through a couple examples. In this case, walls do have some extended properties. If you're familiar with the game, in the later levels, some walls alternate between one pattern versus another. A lot of times it's just an empty section. So in this case, this might alternate between being there and disappearing for a certain amount of time. If we go ahead and change this to a dynamic wall, which we'll do by changing that to true, we'll leave it as an empty alternate wall type of empty. We'll put 5 units of time equal on and off. You'll see that this changed to sort of a dashed line to show you that it's a dynamic wall. But now when we play with this in MAME or build ROMs with this, that will be a wall that is there for half of its time and open for the other half of its time. So that's about it for walls. Let's go through some other stuff. Obviously, the reactor is an important thing here. You need to have a reactor on every level. Let's just move that into a pretty typical spot there. We'll drop it down there. There's no real complex properties except the timer. Default 30 seconds. You can change that up to 99 seconds, I believe, and that's about it. Let's go over to some common stuff first before we get into advanced things. Sparkoids / pyroids. We'll drop one here. As you know, if you're familiar with the game, these just move around, and so they have a velocity property. You can come in here. Now let's talk about units really quick. Units are something you're just going to have to learn to figure out. 10 is actually pretty fast in this case. But what you can do is drag this in here. Once you emulate it in MAME, you'll see how fast it is. Tweak the numbers to get it to move how you want. Technically, you can put in both velocities on a lot of objects here. I caution you about doing that because a couple things can happen. A lot of the collision routines, specifically around the walls, are a little bit funky around wall joints. So if objects are hitting them at the intersection of two segments, sometimes they can slip through, especially if you're doing both x and y velocities and getting things moving in 45-degree angles. You're going to hit those eventually. You also have the ability for it to potentially bounce out of the maze, which would be sort of strange. So typically design it so they stay in the maze. You could certainly change it to be however you want. It isn't going to crash anything, most likely in the game, but you may run into those problems. For now, though, we'll just give it a velocity of 10 in the x-axis and leave it at that. No other real properties. Incrementing velocity is something that many of the objects have. You don't really need to worry about that. That is something that is related to the adaptive difficulty in the settings. If adaptive difficulty is on, it basically takes a multiplier of the sort of the level that you're at and adds some velocity based upon how high of a level you are. So if you had this maze at level 8 and had it at 10 and you warped there, I believe that you would still be at 10. But if you actually went through the levels and played them, you would hit an incrementing velocity at level 4. And so if your incrementing velocity in the x was 1 here, I believe that would mean that by the time you got to level 8, you'd have two incremental adaptive difficulty levels, and so you'd have 2, so you'd end up with 12. If you're playing single mazes, etc., this doesn't do a thing, so you could simply set this to 12. My recommendation is just to ignore incrementing velocities for now, but you will see them if you load the existing mazes, which I'll show you at the very end. You'll see those in use, but that's what they basically are. Percoids, very similar. You can drag one of these guys out. You're going to have a velocity. They shoot on an incremental time, so you don't really have any control over that. It just fires every now and then. Maxoids are new robots that were in the ROMs. These are something you can also play with. They have let's drag one of those guys out here for an example. They have a position. Obviously, they're in the maze. They have a speed, and then they have a trigger distance. Maxes are a little bit strange. We'll set them at medium. We're going to have a trigger distance of 1 grid. They stay where they are until they're activated, and they're activated by Rex getting too close to them. In this case, it's trigger distance of 1 grid. If Rex gets within 1 grid distance of him, he will turn bright red and start pursuing Max at a medium velocity at this point, and he will just track Rex around the maze. You can't kill a Max robot. It just simply is sort of on a seek and destroy mission. Maxes don't transport, however, so that's a way that you can get away from them. Force fields are pretty straightforward. You're familiar with those if you've played the game. Let's throw one of those in here somewhere that might make sense. How about there? Let's talk about the ion cannon. The ion cannon is probably one of the most complex objects on here. Let's throw one down here, using the keyboard arrows to move it around. The ion cannon, as you know, can do all kinds of different maneuvers. There's a whole set of maneuvers. I'm not going to talk through them. What I suggest you do is play with some of the presets. Here's the level 2 one. You can see that level 2, it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't interact with Rex, but it moves around and fires. You can see how these work. You drag them around, and then when it gets to the end, you have to put a return to start, and it'll loop to the top again. You have to have a return to start, otherwise it'll just stop moving, I believe. So we'll say OK, and that's good to go. That's pretty much it with the ion cannons. Trip pads, very similar. You drag them out, you set your percoid, you set your speed, or not your percoid, your pyroid of where it's going to launch out, the velocity of that, and you're good to go. Let's get into the maze objects. Arrows are for coming in. giving direction. Out arrows are for giving hints for how to get out. Oxygens, you can drag those around. You can see that for most of the objects, there's a property of max objects. In this case, you can have 20 oxygens on here. It's a good way to tell whether you're sort of what your bounds are. Once you put out 20 of them, you will not be able to put out any more. It'll give you a warning. One-way arrows, drag that out. Put him right there. Maybe. Stalactites, same difference, drag them around. Levitation boots, there's transporters here. Pull out a transporter. Nope, that's a little off. Well, I'm not going to fix that right now, but that's a bug. It's not sort of snapping into its right positions. Let's see if we can fix it with the mouse. No, it's a little wonky either way. So we'll work on that. One of the niceties of having a click once deployment is if we release new versions that have bug fixes, when you launch the program, it'll give you the option to download the new version automatically, seamlessly. So I would highly suggest downloading those because there will be a lot of bugs, especially in the beginning. Transporters have directions, right or left. They have a color. Don't worry about the is broken, is hidden stuff. That's some stuff for the final homeworld maze. Those might mess you up if you turn either of those to true. If you put a transporter on here, obviously you need to put one in here that is the same color, and that'll be the matching one, and in the opposite direction. So let's make this guy red, or both red, in the opposite direction. Rex will transport between those two, and we'll figure out why these are positioning funny. Locks and keys, very similar. You drop them on here. Looks like this has the same problem currently, so I'm not going to be able to demo that. But same thing. These are just color-based. If you have a key of that color, it'll get rid of the door. Get rid of those. Hide these transporters for now, since they're a little bit ugly. Hand is also in here, and then the clock. If Rex touches the clock, there's no properties on the clock, I don't believe. It's just sort of there, and you can touch him. It'll slow down all the objects in the maze whenever it's activated. Escape pod, you can't put an escape pod on any of the mazes unless they're type B, of course, because it actually has the escape pod shoot over on the right side. So anyway, with that, that's basically how you design mazes. I'm going to cover one thing here really quick. There's a button up here that you can click called Load Mazes from ROM. It's going to default to some resources that come with the program. You can just click OK. What that's going to do, which is actually pretty slick, it lets you see all of the standard mazes from the production ROMs right now. So you can load these, tweak them as a starting point. It's a very good way to start. Learn about how the different motions are for the ion cannons and how things are set up. They're great reference. Level 19 has the level 19 from the Return to Vax. This is a level that I designed without the level editor a long time ago. But you can see how complex you can get these to go. It's pretty cool. I'm going to cover this in a little more detail later, but you can actually run these mazes in MAME. That'll be in the next video, so check it out. Don't forget to save these. You can also save the Promised End ROMs if you want to just open them from a file. Save them in there. You're good to go. Otherwise, you can just re-import them from the template ROMs that are here. So that's about it. Hopefully that should get you started. Have some fun. Design some stuff. Check out the other videos for more information. And we'll catch you next time. Later.